This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Apartment A. The apartment brought her a new sense of calm. She thought of it as her cocoon. Her husband's death had now moved into her back brain and settled down. The head-on collision, the kid texting, the trial, all of it receding into a low-grade ache in the background. In the safety of the apartment, she thought only briefly now about the 3 embryos that lay frozen in the clinic. She, too, was frozen inside. They were together in their suspension of life, on hold. That was enough for now. If her husband's death was stationed in the dark crevices at the back of her brain, the embryos inhabited a space that floated between her eyes, a bright vibration somewhere above her head. It was her old friend Paula who had found the apartment. Her old and only friend now. She'd disconnected from her former life. The apartment was housed in a pudgy white stucco building built in the 1920s. Surrounded by aged, trim yew hedges, with only 4 units, simply called A, B, C, and D. The landlady had told her about the other occupants. Jane had wanted to know who was above her, afraid they might be noisy. "Oh, no," said the landlady. "That's Mary Macaulay. She's very old, lives alone, doesn't go out. Worked her whole life at NASA. Mary Mac, they called her. Kind of famous down there. Her son moved her here a year ago." At night, Jane would sometimes hear the old woman above her. It sounded like she was bumping into furniture. Jane always envisioned her in an astronaut's outfit, puffy and silver, floating through the darkness, knocking the bureaus and chairs, tethered by a cord to some mysterious source of oxygen. She knew this was silly, as the woman had only worked at NASA and was probably a pencil pusher for those 30 years. Yet during the night, when she awoke to the sounds above, a lady astronaut was what she saw through her closed eyelids. The 4 small rooms nestled in the deep plaster walls comforted her. Her mind wandered and lit upon happier memories as she curled in a cozy armchair. Sun shining through the English ivy made dancing shadows on her arms and legs. She thought of the first attempt at an IVF fertility cycle so many years ago. She and Rich were both giddy with hope on the way to the egg retrieval, both so sure it was going to work. They hadn't yet suffered the years of disappointment and loss that would eat away at her natural optimism. As they headed to the clinic, she'd already taken an anti-nausea medication that began to sedate her as she stared out the window of the car into the deepness of the blue sky above. "You know that I used to hear colors as a child," she said dreamily, detached, as if someone else were speaking about her. "Really? People do that. It's called synesthesia, when the senses cross themselves," Rich explained, looking at her sideways. She had thought it would surprise him, this strange fact about her that she'd never shared with anyone except her mother. Of course, Rich would know something about it, and that it even had a name. Rich always knew something about everything. "That doesn't surprise me. You're so in tune with colors. In tune, you get it?" he mused. She gave his inevitable pun the usual half-smile, returning her gaze to the puffs of white clouds that joined together and broke apart, thinking about what lay ahead that day, hoping, praying. In the exam room, he held her hand as she lay back, the paper crinkling under her naked body as the nurse worked the IV into her arm. Another nurse came in with a clipboard. "Dick?" she said rather hesitantly. They both looked up, and Jane could barely stifle a laugh. It's Rich," he said, smiling. Flustered, the nurse looked back at the chart, turning to the top sheet, and explained, "I guess I saw Richard, and then Anyway, Rich, are you ready? The hilarity of the fact that he was being called Dick and then being taken away to give his sperm sample was more than she could contain as the IV sedative kicked in. Fun with Dick and Jane, she laughed and lay back on the gurney. Staring up at the white ceiling, her mind became a jumble of pictures from those early primer books. See Jane run, see Dick run. As a child, letters would swim before her on the page. They played tricks, turning themselves around and making mischief. Alphabet soup, she called it, before the doctor diagnosed it as dyslexia. Letters were hard, something to battle, to tame, to make sense out of the chaos as they mixed and changed. But colors soothed her and spoke to her in a language of sound all her own. Blue was a wave that could wash away scary thoughts, drowning monsters in a calming wall of water, filling her up from the inside. Red was most often just a soft beating, a heart womb that nurtured life and calmed the wild animal inside her from taking flight. She would have to melt into the color to really hear it, dissolve herself into its boundaries until she felt her cells vibrate with the sound of it. Yellow was a silly sun that sounded like an egg sizzling. Green made music, mimicking crickets, grass, and summer with strange clicks and whirs. Her favorite was white. She hadn't even known that it made a sound until she was in the hospital with an acute appendicitis at age 8. She stared up at the white ceiling while her mother stroked her head. The noise of the emergency room faded away and she heard white. Pure, dizzying, clear white cleaned away everything. All her pain dissolving into a deep silence. Silence that had a sound, like snow falling. From then on, white became her safe place. She could make herself hear it by looking at 2 cotton balls, softening her gaze and allowing what she called her whitewash to happen. She'd keep cotton balls in her pocket for that purpose, fingering them, ready to escape when needed. She had finally told her mother about how she could hear sounds when she looked at colors. When her mother looked back at her worriedly, Jane knew she had done something wrong. Sweetheart, I'm sure that's something you will grow out of, but I don't want you to talk to your father or anyone else about it. Your father is under a lot of strain right now, and anyway, let's just keep this between us, okay? For her mother's sake, she never talked about it again. She even tried not to hear colors anymore. She knew her mother worried about it, and her father had already accused her mother of having a stupid, awkward daughter that didn't seem to have inherited any of his genes. Jane knew that her hearing colors could be a weapon used against her and her mother. She forced the sounds out of her head when she heard them, and eventually they quit coming. She still mourned this secret part of herself. After her last miscarriage, she prayed to have her whitewash back and find her safe place again. She strained to hear it, to feel it. She tried painting, immersing herself in the auras of the paint, trying to rediscover her inner language of color, her private landscape of interior sound. She often felt it grow close, then elude her. She found she couldn't force it to happen. Paula had signed her up for a night class on how to write a blog, something Jane had been struggling to do in her attempt to become a food journalist. Writing had always been a challenge for her. She'd been working on a Central American cuisine cookbook for about 7 years and was passionate about food before Rich's death. Cooking was one of the things she felt she did well. They had spent time in various countries in Central America, while Rich worked for the EPA setting up clean water infrastructures in the major cities and suburbs. She tried new foods and collected recipes. Her favorite country had been Guatemala. and she had become fascinated by the indigenous people there. She wanted to travel to Lake Atitlan and experience life with the Mayans, whose culture was still vibrant and alive. Rich had promised her they would spend 2 weeks there at the end of his project. The project ran over, and they never went. She loved the Central Mercado of Guatemala City and took great delight in shopping in the open air, speaking her broken Spanish with gnarled crones and their elaborately embroidered blouses. Their crooked brown fingers holding up the most purple pepper, their teeth brilliant against the contrasting earthy tone of their faces. They gestured to her belly and asked about babies. She answered with a sad shake of her head. They responded to her in words she couldn't understand, but their sympathetic tones and gestures felt more comforting than any of the glib assurances she had received back home. She learned to say hello, Uts Awach, in Cachiquel, a Mayan dialect of the Lake Highlands. The women's faces broadened into enormous smiles at her attempt to speak to them in their own language. They hugged her, forcing her from then on to take vegetables for free. The vegetables were of unusual shapes and drenched hues that matched the shades of the rainbow in the sky after every shower. It was here that she remembered her colors again, remembered what they meant to her, and again felt the sense of loss, a vacancy inside her that mirrored her barren womb. Even then, she hoped that a child would heal the past for her. She wanted the colors back. Arranging all the vegetables on bright platters, she began to paint again, praying the paint would get her closer to what she craved, the sensual intimacy she'd had with colors as a child. Rich admired her painting and encouraged her. He encouraged her in everything. He tried to help her find her colors again. He gave her articles on synesthesia, pointing out to her that it often occurred in artists. Now, years later, her fantasies took her back to Guatemala. Investigating airplane tickets in her bolder moments and picturing herself in a cottage along the lake, painting, cooking, living. She shook the images from her head, bringing herself back to the reality of the armchair and a leg half asleep, the sun setting, and a burgeoning anxiety over the next week's writing class. Apartment B. Another sheet of paper announced itself under the door with a slither. Was it pink or purple? The last purple piece she noticed had transformed itself into angry ink stains that flew about the room, diving and swooping at her before skittering away through the crack in the ceiling. The lights no longer worked, and the refrigerator had ceased its incessant hum. No matter, she thought. She was unsure that she could see much anymore anyway. She felt more than saw the passing of time, by fingering new bruises on her arms and legs. She guessed she got them in her nightly visits to the bathroom. She hadn't left the apartment in months. She used to try to go for walks, but her eyesight was dimming, and she only saw shadows of the creatures that hunted her at night. Those angry black shadows prevented her from sleeping. Her son had stopped calling, or else the phone no longer worked. She wasn't sure. All those years at NASA, so sure of her outcomes and figures, equations. Now, Mary Mac, unsure of anything, was slipping away. She had spent the last 4 days in bed without moving. She'd not meant to, but she fell down on the bare mattress and just didn't get up again. Positioning herself on the bed in such a way that when it rained, she could catch drops of water in her parched mouth, trickling from a hole that had opened in the ceiling. For days, this was the only sensation she felt in her body. Then the boy came. She thinks he climbed down through the ever-widening hole in the floral-patterned plaster surrounding the enameled light fixture. He was different than the things that came for her at night. He was like a cherub, she thought, naked but without wings. She woke to find him perched on the chair next to her bed. His eyes fixed on her did not frighten her. Was he a messenger? Could he help her? Was she seeing with her eyes? He would disappear if she looked away. One night she struggled up to look for him and found she could barely stand, her legs collapsing beneath her as she dragged herself back to the bed. He was there in the room, along with a girl now. The boy sat on his chair, and the girl hugged her knees in the corner. Both naked, their bodies looked as if made from dough. She fell asleep under their watchful stares. She found she didn't even want the water anymore. All she needed now was to watch and be watched, comforted by the presence of the boy and girl. One moment she awoke, although she could not separate sleep from waking, night from day. A glimmer of a feeling told her the children were gone. She felt pain for the first time in a while, although she wasn't sure it came from her body. She couldn't tell. I must find the children, she thought, but now she looked back at the bed and was startled to find that they were there, lying where she had been, their bodies entwined. Lifting their faces up at her, they beckoned to her, welcoming her, their arms waving open to embrace her. She shed her fear and lunged forward in a giant step that felt like falling. But the falling was more like flying. A fall without end. She expected to land on the boy and girl, a melding, a merging of their atoms, but she waited, suspended above them. Then a feeling like a whispered kiss on her ear, the breeze moving a curtain, an emerging oneness that kick-started the final electrical synapse inside her. She fell. The thought exploded in a light so brilliant it blew a hole through the night sky. Oh, Mary Mac, 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 all dressed in black, 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 with silver buttons all down her back. Jane awoke from a pleasant dream in which she and Rich were making love. When she looked up into his face, she noticed it wasn't Rich after all, but it didn't seem to matter. She felt a delicious safety in the man's arms and tried not to wake up. She listened and realized she heard rain. It had been raining for days, but now the sound was more insistent. She struggled out of bed and went into the bathroom. Oh, crap, she thought. She had been watching a stain on the bathroom ceiling. She would lie back in the bath and make a game out of deciding what it looked like. First it was small and grinned like a lopsided smiley face. A few days later, it had changed into a winged dragon, and then had finally spread out into a tea-colored cumulus cloud. She knew she should have told her landlady about it, but the idea of being in the presence of that anxious little woman and workmen invading her apartment was too much for her. Now the cumulus cloud had turned into a full-blown storm of yellowed water, raining down on the clawfoot tub. She dialed her landlady's number. I think the toilet in the apartment above may have overflowed as I have a ton of water coming in my bathroom ceiling, Jane told her. Oh, Jesus, the landlady croaked and hung up. Before Jane could figure out what to do besides position a pot under the biggest torrent, she heard sirens outside. Looking out the window, she saw 2 fire trucks and a police car with its lights flashing. Men's voices filled the hallway as they pounded up the stairs. It seemed a bit dramatic and extreme for an overflowing toilet. Jane collapsed into the easy chair, shivering. There was a knock on her door. She opened it warily to a young fireman with shaggy hair who still looked groggy with sleep. Ma'am, your upstairs neighbor is deceased, he faltered. Because there's widespread damage and flooding to both apartments, I've been told to inform you that you will need to evacuate the premises. Now? She asked, unbelieving. Yes, biorecovery team will be in here. I mean, it's a mess up there. Do you have somewhere to go? He asked, cocking his head to one side. She nodded and walked over to grab her phone. I'll come back to check on you in a minute, he added, joining the others back upstairs. She texted Paula. Old lady died upstairs. I have to leave the apartment tonight because of leaking ceiling. Can I stay with you?" That was the thing about Paula. She slept with her phone next to her bed in case one of her children, ex-husbands, or anyone else needed help. She was a pain, but she was there if you needed her. Jane's screen lit up. "Oh my God! Of course you can stay with me. Do you want me to come get you?" Paula's pleasure at being indispensably needed was palpable. Jane heard her landlady's strident voice in the hallway. "I know I should have checked on her. I thought something might be wrong. You see, my husband's been sick. It's the second round of chemo and—" Jane looked out to see her wringing her hands as she explained to the police officer, who was clearly pained by this interruption to his sleep and finding himself surrounded by old women, one distraught, one dead. Jane poked her head into the hallway, expecting to be sickened by the smell of death coming from the open door of the apartment above. She teetered back stunned and crumpled into a heap on the faded rosebuds of the carpet. She expected to smell the rot of death and decay, along with the heavy mildewed atmosphere, but it was something else that caught her unawares and made her break down, sobbing. There was a sweetness that lingered in the hallway after they had removed the woman's body. It was the smell of Dove soap, the scent of her mother, who she had lost only 3 years before. The fireman pushed open the door to find her in a fetal position on the floor. She couldn't answer as he questioned her. "Oh, shit," he said, and bent his large frame, curving it over her like a mother shielding a child from an explosion. The warmth of his body helped her to stop shaking, and she spoke in sputters. I'm sorry," she croaked. My husband died a few months ago." She straightened herself onto her knees and rocked back and forth as she spoke. He continued to hold her and rocked with her. "You don't need this," he said over and over as she calmed down. She pulled away, embarrassed. "Thank you." She stood up shakily, strengthened by the closeness of his body. She went to the bathroom, washed her face, and grabbed a few things that she threw in her purse. When she came out, he still stood there with a concerned look on his face. He motioned to the old blue Naugahyde suitcase she'd dropped on the ground beside her. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" he asked. Her phone vibrated continually on the coffee table as she looked at the multiple texts and calls from Paula, including the last one that said, "I'm coming over." "The airport?" Jane said jokingly. "No, really, I can get a cab," she added. "Actually, I don't live that far from the airport. It's pretty much on my way home, if you're serious," he told her. "Are you sure?" she asked. "No problem," he added. He grabbed her bag. She turned her phone to airplane mode as she followed him out. Light was just beginning to crest on the horizon, and the rain had stopped as they climbed into his truck. She was surprised to see the fire chief emblem adorning its doors, and she realized she'd underestimated his age, discerning fine traces around his eyes that were now visible in the morning light. She glanced out to the rain-glazed street and saw Paula's minivan pulling around the corner, just as the fireman started his engine and moved the truck slowly forward. Jane thought Paula spotted her as the cars passed each other, and she turned to watch Paula park in front of the apartment building. A wave of relief rushed through her body as they accelerated onto the freeway, and she relaxed into the corner of the bench seat. The fireman rambled on about the strange circumstances of the old lady's death. He said it was unusual that the body had not decomposed more, but the thing that spooked the fireman the most was that when they went to break down the door, they found it was unlocked. "Unlocked, just like that," he kept repeating to her, as if the fact that old Mary Mac had lain up there alone all that time was all the more unnerving because her door was unlocked. Jane gazed at the raindrops that the wind chased off the waxy finish of the truck's cherry red hood. She was shivering hard, losing all sense of the present, when she heard a faint heartbeat. Something old and familiar awakened in a corner of her mind. She took a deep breath and stared hard at the reflection of the truck's red paint. Don't scare it, she said to herself. She took another breath. She dove into the red, submerging herself in the vibrations of a womb, a place she could be reborn. Beat, beat, beat. She heard it. Her jaw tensed with joy. Settling back in the seat, she let the sound inside her build to a crescendo that vibrated right down to her core, leaving her trembling, limp, triumphant. The fireman's friendly voice in the background brought her back to the present. She was leaving. She knew a flight that connected through Orlando to Guatemala City that left at 10:37. She smiled again as she looked up at the pure, white promise of the morning sky. Her safe place now awakening again within her. She listened intently to the white. The sound of snow falling on the new day.
That was The Sound of Snow, written and read by Ellenora Cage.
Hi, Ellenora, or should we call you Elle?
Hi, guys. Yeah, Elle's fine.
Thanks for joining us on The Strange Recital.
I really love your guys' podcast, so thanks for having me.
Tell us a little about yourself, your writing experience, your interests.
Well, I've always been writing, even as a little girl. My younger years, I mostly wrote and performed poetry in New York City. Fiction's always been a love. I just kept feeling like it was something I'd get to later in life when I was older, more experienced, I guess. It's really tough. It's difficult, fiction. Here I am. I guess I'm older. I wrote a lot of personal essays when I was going through a long struggle with infertility. And now that I'm a mom, the fictions just come. And, I don't know. Moms need to be good at making up stories, right?
Yeah.
So, tell me, what was the origin or inspiration for The Sound of Snow?
Well, I think most of my best writing just comes to me. This story came to me in the middle of the night. It started writing itself over the next couple of days. It just stuck in my head. I was lucky enough to get this one down on paper. It's not always the case, or most often not the case.
Yeah.
I'd heard of synesthesia and was fascinated by it, like everyone, I think. There was really nothing that really prompted the story. Like I said, it's just something. Sometimes these stories come to me, and I feel more like a channeler for the words. And I don't really feel like I'm in control.
That's always a good feeling. I know that feeling. I've always found synesthesia really interesting. Years ago, I enjoyed a book called The Man Who Tasted Shapes. It's a syndrome that gets my mind going about the nature of inner experience. I think it suggests the metaphorical or even aesthetic nature of sensory experience, as if it's not actually real, but is sort of arbitrary in its expression, like able to choose different masks. The qualia of experience, the smell of a rose, for example, can change, which gets into what is called the hard problem of science. Where does consciousness, that qualia experience, actually come from? There's no answer. Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
Wow. I'm going to have to put my Philosophy 101 cap back on here for these questions. I'm thinking about the two women and how their stories intersect. For me, obviously, they're touching on the natures of consciousness and being, and how our physical bodies, what's physical, what's not. In the case of Mary Mack, her physical body's beginning to break down. Mm-hmm. Her senses are changing. She doesn't know what's real, what's not real.
Nor do I.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're doing here, isn't it?
Yeah, and it kind of relates to Jane in the sense that, okay, these qualia or these sensations that seem to make us up. Do they define us or we them? These things are so intrinsic and private. They seem to be only be able to be felt or understood by the experiencer. Mm-hmm. I guess that's what they call ineffable.
Yeah.
Well, I've always wanted to be a painter. The idea of a painter with synesthesia is really interesting. Making a painting could be a very noisy experience, or quite musical, or if each colour is a smell or a taste, painting could be nauseating or quite exquisite.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, my husband read about a woman who smelled faces. Mm. Every face for her had a smell associated with it. That sounds really tough. It didn't work out that well for her in her love life.
Yeah, I bet.
She stayed with a guy who was a real jerk, but he smelled great.
What if, as some gurus suggest, at the core of so-called reality, the experience and the experiencer are one and the same? In other words, there's no actual self at all, but only an ongoing flow of experience.
Mm.
Right, which might consist of tasting shapes or hearing colors.
Right.
Wow. I don't know. Are we beings having experiences or just a bundle of experiences thinking we are beings?
Yeah.
Well, we like unanswerable questions here. And I know Brent does, as you can tell. But maybe this one is easier. There are some interesting details in the story that suggest you've traveled to Guatemala. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Tom, it doesn't really get any more concrete here. I mean, I've traveled all over the world, but I've only been to Guatemala in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good way to travel. Less degrading to the environment.
Yeah. My soul feels like it's lived on the shores of Lake Atitlan before, and I'd like to go there. My parents were crazy beatniks who moved with me to southern Mexico when I was 6 weeks old. And I spent my first formative years in a very similar culture with all its colors and sounds. So I always feel like that's always been a part of my interior landscape.
Mm. The dreams of the old lady in the story as she dies are quite unique. What do her visions of the young boy and girl mean to you?
I think they're a connection to her inner divine feminine, divine masculine, the sort of animus and anima in each of us. It's also an embrace of childhood. My parents are getting older, and I definitely see them returning to a state of being childlike, and I think that's how we pass out of this when we shake off this physical shape. That's kind of as we get ready for that.
Yeah, I'm getting older, and I'm getting more childish too, by the minute.
I'm looking forward to it. Being an adult hasn't been all it's been cracked up to be. I think also Mary Mack is ready to let go. And I think she's the one sensation that she has left that she's ready to let go of is the sensation of longing. And that she's going to let that go and become one with the children. And that's who she perceives as other. So it's sort of also emerging with the universe.
Yeah. That song, Mary Mack, when my teenage daughter was much younger, about Tom's daughter's age, Mary Mack was her favorite song with the hand claps and all that.
Yeah. That song just came to me again in on the universal wavelength when I was writing about that character. Her name was Mary. And as she was dying, that song just kept coming into my head. And I knew that the character Mary, I named her Mary Macaulay so that she would fit with the song. I knew that she would have known that song as a child. And then it kind of becomes her funeral dirge too as she goes on to the next realm.
Yeah.
At the end of the story, Jane decides to leave her friend behind, fly off to Guatemala. It feels like a sort of escape, or perhaps a rebirth into a new phase of life. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Tom, I think it's both. I think Jane is finally sort of escaping from this sort of typical feminine existence where she's spent most of her life trying to do for others and to please others. And with the death of her husband, she starts to try to reimagine herself. This apartment becomes this cocoon away from anything she's ever known in her life. And the death of the old lady upstairs is this cathartic event that allows her to take flight. I think this choice, this active choice, which is really the first choice that she's made in her life, that's just for her, opens her up and allows her colors to come back to her and to find that thing that is specific only to her. And I feel like we know that she's going to be okay because in this next chapter that she's heading out to, because she's found her safe space. She's found her colors again.
So there's a kind of optimism there in there among all the death.
Well, and she does have three embryos in storage, so you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, right. Well, time grows short, which of course is never true, but we humans like to say stuff like that. So thanks for your story and your time, Elle.
Thank you, guys. You guys have been fantastic. Thank you.
We try. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music you heard on this episode was a background drone called Ohm by audionautics.com, followed by Cupcake Marshall by Blue Dot Sessions. This is episode 19062. Ellenora has me wondering about the sound of clouds.